All right, Rabbosai, good morning. Let us begin today's daf, beautiful daf ahead of us today, beginning by thanking our sponsors, Sammy and Malka Esterson, as our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Kislev, for dedicating all of the shiurim and drashos this month in memory of their parents, Yitzchak Leib ben Aaron HaKohen, Sarah Rachel Bas Baruch Avram, and Hinda Bas Henech Ephraim. We hope that of the merit of our Talmud Torah, the Neshamos have an Aliyah, and the family in Nechama. We thank our week of learning sponsors, Paul and Kathy Pollack, for dedicating all of the shiurim and drashos this week in memory of Paul's aunt, Esther Pollack, Esther Bas Zechariah, whose yahrzeit is the 29th of Kislev today. We also thank our day of learning sponsor, Akiva Wexelbaum, in memory of Chana Bas Rab Naftali. Zichron Livrach. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, the Neshama will have an Aliyah and the family in Nechama. We thank our ongoing Daf Yomi sponsors for the Nschus of Refuah Shalema, for Ruchama Aviva Bas Shenachana, as well as for Rachel Yehudis Bas Tova Gittel. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, Kol Yisrael will have a complete and enduring refuah. And with that, let us begin. So today's daf, beautiful daf ahead of us today. Today's daf is Chaf Daled 24. We are picking up in Meretz Hashem on Chaf Gimel Amud Beis 23b, and we're picking up at the period. It's about 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, about 16 lines up from the bottom. So remember again, we are still going to spend a good part of today focused on the Machlokes Chizkiah and Rabbi Avo. Namely, that halacha l'maisa, when you see an Isser Achila in the Torah, what does that Isser Achila mean? So remember again, Chizkiah says, under normal circumstances, an Isser Achila means just that. An Isra Achila and no more. Therefore, again, by Chometz, when there is a protracted form, a prolonged form of the Isra Achila, which is written Lo Ye Achel, that is what teaches us, that elongated form is what teaches us the Isra Hana as well as the Isra Achila. But under normal circumstances, an Isra Achila just means a prohibition to eat. Rabbi Avo, on the other hand, explains that Halacha L'maisa, anytime that you go ahead and you see an Isra Achila, Isra Achila, by definition, automatically includes an Isra Hana, unless, of course, what? Unless, of course, you are told to the contrary. So unless, of course, Halacha L'maisa, one is told that, like we see by Nevela, that Hana is permitted, we assume that every Isra Achila automatically includes an Isra Hana. So let's go weiter. So the Gemara says as follows. So Yosef Hahu Mirabana Kamed Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachmani. So those are the particular Talmud Chacham who was sitting in front of Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachmani. Yosef V'kam Rishlit Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi, and he was saying over the following ruling in the name of Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi. Minayin lekol yisurin shebatorah dechi hechi da asurin b'achi lahakanami asurin b'ana. How do you know that in general, any time that there is an Isser Achila, that also includes an Isser Hana? So the Gemara says, and what is he referring to? Ma'inihu chametz b'Pesach v'shar haniskal. So where does he know, for example, in things like chametz on Pesach, shar haniskal, how do you know that halacha l'maisa, the Isser Achila, also includes an Isser Hana? Minayin teipuk le'mi lo yachal. So I don't understand, what do you mean, where do you know it from? You know it from lo yachal. That's what the pasuk says. Lo yachal Isser Achila mashmalei, Isser Hana lo mashmalei. So this is actually very interesting. So according to this approach of Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi, Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi said, is there somewhere else that I learned this out from? Right? Is there potentially somewhere else where this could be derived? Because after all, again, as much as you're learning something from Lo Ye Achel still is Lashon Achila. In other words, this is very interesting, because now we're taking a little bit of a turn. What Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi is saying is there another source for this concept that an Isser Achila also includes an Isser Hana? You're going to say, I need another source. We already have a source. Lo Ye'achal, because let's remember again, what's the beauty of Lo Ye'achal? What's the beauty? The beauty is everyone agrees with it. Remember again, if you're Rabbi Avo, Lo Ye'achal automatically includes Hana, because every Isra Achila includes an Isra Hana. And even according to Chizkiah, the fact that the Isra Achila is phrased in a prolonged or protracted form indicates us that it includes an Isra Hana. So everyone is in agreement that Halacha L'maisa, we have an Isra Hana, so why do you need another source? To which the Gemara says, because I'd like to know an Isra Hana, not from an Isra Achila. To which the Gemara says, why don't you go ahead and learn it out from the Vela? Rabbi says, remember again, what does it mean to learn out from the Vela? Nevela is an example of an Isra Achila that clearly doesn't include an Isra Hana. But from that I can learn that every other stam, unqualified Isra Achila, by definition, does include an Isra Hana. So look at So remember again, he says, no, Nevela is necessary according to Rabbi Yehuda, because Rabbi Yehuda teaches us that halacha l'maisa dvarim kichsavan, which means that what? To go ahead and give us a specific order for the disposal of nevela. Namely, that nevela has to be disposed of either how? By selling it to the ger, by giving it to the ger, or selling it to the nachri. If he learns out that nevela, it teaches us the din, like we saw in the name of Rabbi Yehuda, then why not learn out the Isra Achila, the Isra Hana, from where Rabbi Yehuda learns it out from, namely, again, Lakelav Tashlichon also, Milakelav Tashlichon also, Kasavr Chulin Shnishchetu Ba'azar Da'oraisa. Because he holds that the prohibition to go ahead and give chulin shnishchetu ba'azara, right, which means again an unconsecrated animal that was shechted inside of the confines of the Beis Hamikdash, the prohibition to give that to your dog is in fact da'oraisa, and he learns that out. Lakelev tashlichon oso. What can you throw to the dogs? Basar basada treifa. You can give the treifa to your dogs. What can't you give to your dogs? Chulin shenishchetu ba'azara. So because of that, again, he needs that pasuk teaching it differently. Therefore, again, minayin. So again, just to keep focused, Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi is coming along and trying to say, from where do I learn that every Isra Achila is also an Isra Hana? For a variety of different reasons, he does not want to lose it. He does not want to learn it from any of the aforementioned sources. So where can I learn it from? Minayin. Dichsiv, this is very interesting. Kol chatas hashayuva midama. So we'll say, so the pasuk in its entirety over here is Kol chatas hashayuva midama el olmoy lechaber b'kodesh lo seachal ba'ish teisarei. So we'll say, we're talking about over here. We're talking about. Actually, take a look at Rashi. It's Rashi in the fourth line from the bottom. Kol chatas hashayuva midama lav b'chatos hapanim yoshuva g'daman k'mitzvasan lifnim ksiv. So we'll say, we're not talking about over here a chatas hapanimis. We're not talking about a chatos who's supposed to have a blood application inside of the Beis Hamikdash. Rather, again, skip a little bit. Ela lelamid achatas hachitzona then hichnis dama lifnim psula. What's the interesting halacha? If you have a chatos whose blood was supposed to be only applied outside, when I say outside, meaning on the mizbeach hachitz, on the outer mizbeach, and you come along and you apply that blood on the inner mizbeach. What's the halacha? The halacha is the carbon is pasul. The carbon is pasul, and the Torah says ba'ish tisaref. The halacha is you have to go ahead. Lo se'achel, you cannot eat it, meaning you being the Kohen. The Kohen cannot eat it. Ba'ish tisaref. Rather, again, this chatos is burnt in the fire. So we'll say two halachas being learned over here. If you inappropriately applied the blood of an outer chatos inside of the Beis Hamikdash, two halachas. Halacha number one is ultimately, again, it cannot be eaten, lo ye'achel. Halacha number two, ba'ish tisaref. The carbon must be burnt. Now watch this. This is very exciting. So the Gemara says, Shein tal ba'ish tisaref. The Torah doesn't have to tell me ba'ish tisaref. We don't need that phrase. We'll see why in just a moment. But I don't need to be told that an invalid carbon is burnt in the fire. Umat tamlor ba'ish tisaref. So therefore, why does the Torah say ba'ish tisaref? To which the Gemara says, so we'll say, why don't I need a pasuk? Again, we'll say a very specific case. I have a chatas, in this basically like a general chatas. We'll say the only chatas whose blood is applied in the interior of the Beis Hamikdash is the Yom Kippur avoda, right? But otherwise, a stam chatas, a regular chatas, the blood is applied on the mizbeach hachitz, on the outer mizbeach. Torah now tells me that if I apply the blood inside, what's the halacha? Two halachas. Number one, lo yachel, the chatas can't be eaten. Halacha number two, ba'ish tisaref. I don't need the pasuk to tell me ba'ish tisaref. I don't need the pasuk to tell me that ultimately, again, the carbon, the invalid chatas, has to be burnt. Why? I already learned that. We'll say, where did I learn that from? Dichsiv v'hinei soraf. Because Rabbi said the pasuk said v'hinei soraf. Now what is this talking about? Rabbi say, watch this. Rashi says im eino inyan legufo dak v'hinei soraf b'seir nachshon b'vayihi bayom hashmini. Rabbi say incredible by the Chanukah Samizbeach, right? By the Chanukah Samizbeach. So ultimately, again, the pasuk says The consecration of the Beis Hamikdash, of the Mishkan. Vayiba Yom Hashmini Ka'amar Le Moshe Lama Saraftem Oso. Let's remember again, this was after the death of Nadav and Avihu. So ultimately, again, Moshe saw that Aaron and his remaining sons had burnt the seer, burnt the chatos of Nachshon, and he asked them, Hein lo huva dama ela kodesh penima. Moshe Rabbeinu didn't understand why they burned the chatas. Remember again, why did they burn the chatas? Remember Rashi says, why did they burn the chatas? Because they were in a state of aninos. Remember again, because Nadav and Avihu had just died. So because that they burnt the chatas. Moshe Rabbeinu comes, he sees that the seir of Nachshon, the chatas of Nachshon ben Aminadav, was burned. Moshe then says, why did you burn it? Hein lo huva dama bakodesh. I know that you didn't accidentally sprinkle the blood in the interior of the Beis Hamikdash, of the Mishkan, which also tells us what? That blood of a chatos that is not supposed to be sprinkled inside of the Mikdash and is done, so you burn it. So we'll say, therefore, again, let's connect this all together. Therefore, halacha l'maisa, when the Torah tells me, kol chatas asher yuva midama, that any blood of a chatas that's inappropriately applied inside of the Beis Hamikdash, the Torah doesn't have to tell me that it has to be burned. The carbon has to be burned. Why? I already learned that in Parashat Shmini. I already learned that halacha from the dedication of the Mishkan. So why is there a need ultimately again to state it again? So we'll say, therefore, what do we say? Emeino inyan. Then we'll say again, if I don't need it for this particular subject, then let me apply it to something else. Top of Chav Dalid. I don't need that to teach me that I can't go ahead and eat the chatas whose blood has been misapplied. Why not? Because the pasuk also explicitly says, Lo ye'achel. V'me'eno inyan la'achila, t'neu inyan le'isser hana. Then we'll say, ultimately, again, use it for an Isser Hana. So we'll say, see what's happening over here? This is very exciting. So remember, again, keep track of what's happening over here. Rabbi Shua Levi is coming along and saying, where else can we learn that an Isser Achila also means an Isser Hana? Where else can we learn that from? What do you else can we learn it from? Why can't you just learn it out from where Chizkiah is learning it out from? Lo Yachel, right? Or for Rabbi Avo, Lo Socha, Lo Yochel, Lo Socha, Lo Yochlu. Because Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi says, you know what? I'd like to learn it out from a source that doesn't talk about Achila. Is there a source that could convey this halacha that doesn't discuss achila? The Gemara says, okay, fine. Says Rabbi Shimon Levi, I'd like to make a suggestion. There's a pasuk that talks about the blood of a chatos, which was accidentally intentional, doesn't really matter. But it was applied inside of the Beis Hamikdash, in the inner mizbeach, when that should not have happened. What happens to the chatos? So the Torah says two things. Number one, ba'ish tisaref. Number one, you have to burn the chatos, and lo ye'achel. It cannot be consumed by the kohanim. So let's analyze this. Says the Gemara, why does the Torah have to tell me ba'ish yisaref, that the chatos has to be burned? I already know that a chatos whose blood application is flawed has to be burned. Where do I learn that out from? Parsha Shmini, dedication of the Mishkan, the Seir of Nachshon ben Aminadav. Moshe Rabbeinu sees that it was burned, and he says, why did you burn it? After all, again, its blood was not misapplied in the interior of the Mishkan, which tells us that blood of a chatas that is misapplied in the interior of the Mikdash ultimately again is burned. So therefore, again, what does Be'ish Tisreif teach me? Can't teach me ultimately again. Okay, so therefore, and if I don't need it by chatas, apply it to other things. And if I don't need it, ultimately again, to teach me an Isser Achila, because Isser Achila is stated explicitly in the pasuk, then what? Then ultimately again, learn it, use it to teach me an Isser Hana. And therefore I will say from Ba'ish Tisaref by chatas, I'm going to learn that any item that is not permitted for consumption automatically becomes prohibited bahana as well. Pretty incredible. But if that's the case again, I will say, then I should say, just like a chatas, which is asr ba'achila, asr ba'ana, is burned, so to everything else that is asr ba'achila and asr ba'ana should be burned as well. Amakra ba'kodesh ba'ish titzaref. Pasuk says, ba'kodesh, something that is kodesh, shall be burned in the fire. Darshan, ba'kodesh b'sreifa, ve'en kol yisrael shavu Torah b'sreifa. Ultimately, again, it's only kodesh that becomes Asr Ba'ana, which is burned, but other items, ultimately, again, when they become Asr Ba'ana, need not be burned. So Rabbi Shimon Levi, is this true? That this Bakodesh Ba'ish Tishrei comes to teach me that anytime there's an Isra Achila, there's also an Isra Hana? So the Gemara says, Hami Bari Leidich Rabbi Shimon. I need this Ba'ish Tisaref to teach like Rabbi Shimon. What does Rabbi Shimon say? This sound Rabbi Shimon Omer Bakodesh Ba'ish Tisaref Limit Al Chatas Shesarfen Osa Bakodesh. So ultimately, again, Rabbi Shimon taught me that this teacher will say that where do you dispose of an invalid Chatas? You have to dispose of it ultimately again Bakodesh, in the Azara. Rabbi say, look at Rashi, Limit Al Chatas Psula Shesrefasa Bakodesh Ba'azara. So also the Gemara says, 1 second, this Ba'ish Tisaref is not free for drasha, right? It's not unused, it's used for a very important ruling. Namely, that if you have to go ahead and burn an invalid chatos, where do you burn it? Bakodesh Tisaref, right? Bakodesh Ba'ish Tisaref. You have to go ahead and burn it in the Azar. You can't just burn it anywhere. You have to burn it in the courtyard of the Beis HaMikdash. Ve'inli elazu bilvad. I only know this particular halal, this particular carbon, chatos. Psulei kadshe kadoshim ve'imure kachim kalamina. How do I know that the truth is any invalid sacrificial item has to be burnt in the Azara? Talmud lomar v'chol bakodesh ba'ish tisref. Therefore, the pasuk says anything that is kodesh, ultimately again, should be burnt in the Kodesh, right? Anything that is invalid is burnt in the Kodesh, burnt in the Azara. So therefore it turns out that Rabbi Yeshua's attempted limud to teach us that every Isra Achila also means an Isra Hana, that he tried to go ahead and bring from Chatos, didn't really work out. Because it turns out that the phrase that he wanted to go ahead and use this for, Ba'ish Tisaref, actually teaches me a different halacha, namely that any invalid sacrificial item is burnt, and specifically burnt in the Azara, burnt within the precincts, the confines of the Beis HaMikdash itself. Good. So Amar le Rabbi Yonasan. So Rabbi Yonasan said, "The Rabcha, your Rebbe, right? Your Rebbe." Ultimately, again, the Gemara says, "Your Rebbe." Rashi says, Amar le Hahumi Rabban Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachmani, the Akshide Haikushya. So again, this Rabbi Yonasan ultimately said to Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachmani, your Rebbe Mehaikra Kamarle actually learned out this halacha from a different source. What's the source? Well, say the pasuk says, V'im yivhaser mi bisar hamiluim umin halechem ad haboker v'sarafta es hanosar ba'ish lo ye'achel ki kodeshu. So halacha l'maaseh, if you go ahead and you leave over from the meat of the offerings of the miluim, so then halacha l'maaseh again, or from the bread until the morning, what's going to happen? Lo yachel, it should not be eaten, but ki kodeshu, ultimately again because it is consecrated. So the Gemara says, what's going on over here? So we'll say, take a look. All right, we'll catch the Rashi after. So the Gemara says as follows: Shein tawin lomar lo ye'achel. The pasuk doesn't have to say you don't have to. You can't eat it, because we'll say after all again. Once you say that halacha l'maisa is supposed to be burned, there is no need to go ahead and say it can't be eaten. Obviously, if you have to burn it, you can't consume it. If that's the case, then why does it say lo yachel? If you don't need it for the actual Isra Achila, for this leftover sacrificial item, because the pasuk says you shall burn the leftovers in the fire. Then ultimately again use it for Shar Isurin to teach me what? Well, let's see. This is Shar Isurin Shabbatorah. And if I don't need it to generate an Isra Achila, then ultimately again use it to teach a principle, which is anytime in the Torah you find an Isra Achila also automatically means Isra Hana. So I'll say, but if that's the case, I would say, just like over here, if there's a din in Sreifa, that where there's an Isra Hana, you have to burn the item. Af kol Yisur in Shabbat Torah b'Sreifa. So too, again, all Yisur in the Torah should be b'Sreifa. Amakra, to which the pasuk comes to address that, V'sarafta sanosar, you shall burn the nosar. Noser b'shreifa. We'll say it's only carbonic matter that falls under the category of noser, which is leftover sacrificial items. Only noser has to be burned. Ve'in kol yisurin shebatorah b'shreifa. But we'll say other yisurin do not have to be burnt through shreifa, or do not have to be burnt. V'hai lo yachal lahachi uda'asa. But does this lo yachal come to teach me this halacha? After all, again, haimi b'alei l'chid Rabbi Elazar. I need this Rabbi Elazar. What Rabbi Elazar? Lo, so Pasuk says, Lo ye'achel ki kodeshu, kol sheva kodesh pasal. Anything that is kodesh, I will say, once it becomes leftover past its prescribed time, is going to be pasal. Not only is it asr, but it's pasal. What is that? What's the ramification of that? So Torah comes to give an additional prohibition on the consumption of any sacrificial item left over past its permitted time. Okay, so therefore, both say, once again, our attempt to prove that an Isra Achila also means an Isra Hana from an alternate source has not worked out. Amar Abaye, the Olam Mikra Kama. Abaye says no. In fact, again, the fact that an Isra Achila ultimately, again, also means an Isra Hana is going to be learned out from the original pasuk that we mentioned. Rashi says, Mikra Kama, V'chol Chatos, V'lav mi ba'ish tisarif. This Chichloma Shisraf Ba'azara. Ela milo se'achel. So we'll say Abaye is going back to the original pasuk quoted by Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi. Right? That pasuk ultimately again by the Chatos. Right? By the Chatos, the Lashon, the pasuk of Kol Chatos asher yuva midama. That's what we're learning out from. The Gemara says, now watch this. I'm sorry, Veifoch. Let the pasuk just say, remember again, this is the Chatas whose blood was misapplied in the interior of the Mikdash. So let the pasuk just go ahead and say, Ba'ish tisaref, and you don't have to say lo seachel, which also makes sense. Obviously, if you have to burn something in the fire, it means you're not allowed to eat it. Ma tamalomer lo seachel. We'll say second wide line chavdal amud aleph. Why does the pasuk say it can't be consumed? If I don't need to teach me Isra Achila, as we said before, ultimately like Rabbi Elazar, then use that lo seachel for the rest of the Isurin Sheba Torah. And I will say, if I don't need it to generate an Isra Achila by other items in the Torah, because again, generally, when something is prohibited for consumption, the Torah explicitly says that, ultimately, again, use it to generate an Isra. So therefore, I will say, what Abaye is suggesting now is going back to the pasuk of Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi, namely by the Chatos, whose blood was misapplied in the interior of the Mikdash. The Torah says, "Ba'ish lo yachal ba'ish tisaref." So obviously, if it tells me about ish tisaref, I have to burn in the fire, I know that I can't eat it. If that's the case, again, that I can't eat it, that lo yachal is extra. But so what am I doing with that lo yachal? I'm using it to teach me that halacha l'maisa, anytime something is aser ba'achila, it is also aser ba'ano. Makan sreifa. But if that's the case, then why don't you say, just like by the chatas with the misapplied dam, so too again, the way you have to dispose of it is through sreifa. So too, anytime something is aser ba'ano, you have to dispose of it with sreifa. Amar Kra Hanosar. The pasuk says Nosar Hanosar b'sreifa ve'in kol yisurin sheva Torah b'sreifa. It's only Nosar and other like items, sacrificial items, that ultimately again have to be disposed of through sreifa, but ultimately again other isurin in the Torah do not require sreifa. Amar li Rapapa la'Abaye ve'ima liachude le'lav legufehu da'asa. So Papa says to Abaye, but maybe again, this phrase is coming to go ahead and put forward an additional lav, to which the Gemara says, the I mid Rabbi Elazar in lokin alav shebechlalus. Because also, when according to Rabbi Elazar, the problem is it gives a more specific lav, right, of lo yi achel, because otherwise, again, we have what's called a lav shebechlalus. Lav shebechlalus also means like a general lav. So maybe, again, according to Rabbi Elazar, you would not be able to give malchus based on a general lav. Therefore, the Torah comes along and gives you lo yi achel, which is a more specific lav, focused on this case of the chatas with the misapplied dam. So we'll say, so once again, kind of knocking a hole, or what is it, creating a hole in the argument ultimately of Abaye. Papa says, no. We're going to learn out the fact that every Isra Achila has an Isra Hana from here. V'habasra asher yiga b'chol tamei, lo ye'achel, ba'esh yisaref. So we'll say, the pasuk says, sacrificial meat, that comes in contact with anything that is tamei, lo ye'achel, should not be consumed, ba'ish yisaref. It should be burned in the fire. So it says the Gemara, Shein tamei lomar lo ye'achel. So we'll say, now remember again, it's a good kasha. Once the Torah tells me, ba'ish yisaref, then what? Then what? I don't need what? Lo ye'achel. Right? We'll say logically, if you tell me that I have to destroy the item in the fire, it means I can't eat it. So you're telling me now that a piece of sacrificial meat that came in contact with something that is tummy must be burned in the fire. Once you tell me that it has to be burned in the fire, I know that I can't eat it. So what does the lo yachel come to teach me? Why do I need that lo yachel? If I don't need it to teach you the actual isra achila by the sacrificial meat which becomes tummy, because once I can learn that out, I can learn out the fact that sacrificial meat which becomes tamei is aser ba'achila, and I can learn that out from Meiser Sheni. Uma Meiser Hakal Amra Torah Lo Bi'arti Mimenu B'tamei. Right, by Meiser, Abose Meiser Sheni, which is considered to be one of the most lenient forms of consecrated property, and yet what do I say? Lo Bi'arti Mimenu B'tamei. I never ate of it when I was tamei. That's part of Vidui Meiser, part of the confession of Meiser. I never consumed it in a state of tumah. Basar Kodesh Chamr Lakoshkin Abosai. If I can't eat Meiser Sheni in a state of tumah, then what? Then what? It goes without saying that halacha lamaisa, I can't go ahead and consume. I can't consume sacrificial meat in a state of tumah. So therefore, I will say, why do I need lo ye'achel? Ultimately, again, by the case of sacrificial meat. So you will say, oh, 1 second. You can't go ahead and administer a punishment based on a kal v'chomer. So therefore, again, I need sacrificial meat to have its own limud. To which the Gemara says, "Keishahu." In reality, again, this is not simply a kal v'chomer, but rather, again, this is a hekish. This is a comparison. D'chsiv lo sucha lecho b'sharecha masar degan chasirosh chavitzarecha ubechoros v'karcha matamadomer lo yiachel. So we'll say, why does it say you can't eat it? Im eno inyan legufo tenei inyan lecholitzon shabbatorah. So we'll say, ultimately, again, if the Torah itself is giving me an isra achila by these relatively cool, mekeldik things, right? These lenient things, then it goes without saying that halacha lamaisa, again, there's going to be an isra achila by sacrificial meat. So why do we need the lo yachel by the sacrificial meat which becomes tamei? So Rabbi says, so maybe lo yachel by the sacrificial meat which becomes tamei is not there to teach me an isra achila, but rather what is it there to teach me? An isra hana. Therefore, we'll say, maybe it's coming to teach you that halacha lamaisa, whenever there is an isra achila always generates an isra hana. Well, if that's the case, if the source for this halacha is going to be sacrificial meat which becomes tamei, then what? Then halacha lamaisa, I should say, just as sacrificial meat, which is asr ba'achila and asr ba'ana, has to be burned, so to any item that is asr ba'achila and asr ba'ana has to be burned. Amrikra hanosar b'sreifa ve'in kol yisur and sheba Torah b'sreifa. Ultimately, again, it's only nosar and other like sacrificial items that have to be burned. But I will say, halacha l'maisa, other items, even if they are both asr ba'achila and ba'ana, do not necessarily have to be burned. Amrli Ravina Ravashi. So we'll say, watch this. So Ravina said to Ravashi, maybe. So we'll say, so all of this is based on the fact that the Torah tells me by sacrificial meat which becomes tamei, lo ye'achel ba'ish yisaref. So we'll say on a very basic level, once you're telling me ba'ish yisaref, you have to burn it, obviously I can't eat it. And furthermore, we also see that even consecrated items of much lower sanctity, once they become tamei, you can't eat it. So I don't need an isra achila over here. So therefore, essentially what the Gemara is saying is, halacha l'maisa, it must be that the isra achila here is not an isra achila, but rather what? It's an isra hana. So what's the kasha? If it's an isra hana, why would the Torah phrase an isra hana as an isra achila? Why would you phrase a prohibition on benefit as a prohibition on consumption? And what's the answer? To teach me a principle. And what's the principle? Every time the Torah espouses an isra achila, by definition it also includes what? An isra hana. That's the argument. That's the argument. To which the Gemara says, I don't know. Amrli Ravina Ravashi, maybe. We'll say maybe not. Maybe what the Torah is coming to do over here when it says lo yachel by tainted sacrificial meat is to tell you that if you eat sacrificial meat which became tamei, maybe you're in violation of two prohibitions, two lavim. Let's say, what are the two lavim? Right? What are the two lavim? Number one, lo yachel, and number two, ba'ishi sarif. Right? That again, I'm supposed to burn it, and also again, is an isser hano. So, or even let's leave aside isser hano. That I'm not supposed to eat it, I'm supposed to burn it, and therefore, if I go ahead and I consume it, maybe I have violated two lavim. So maybe again, the extra lo yachel is not coming to teach me a principle vis-a-vis all of the isurim of a Torah, but it's just coming to teach you that if I eat sacrificial meat which has become tamei, I violated two lavim. After all, again, we have this concept, lav mi amar abayi acha putisa loke arba, nimala loke chamesh. For example, I will say, there are concepts like this in halacha, where one act of consumption could generate many prohibitions. If you eat a potisa, Rashi says, is sheretz hamayim. Is a sheretz, a creepy, crawly thing that lives in the water. So halacha l'maisa, if you consume a sheretz hamayim, then halacha l'maisa, again, you have violated 4 isurim. Rashi goes through the various isurim. Similarly, again, if you go ahead and you eat an ant, loki chamesh, ultimately, again, you are in violation of 5 lavin. 5 lavin. We'll say, that's why, again, people, it's very, the whole notion of checking vegetables for bugs is not just a chumrah. It's a very important halacha, because again, it's one thing if a person's going to commit an aveira and get something out of it. But to go ahead and commit an aveira and multiple averas and get mamish nothing out of it, it's totally counterintuitive. So the amount of averas that are the number of lavin associated with the consumption of shratzim. We'll say a person eats 1 sheretz, and by definition they go ahead and they violate multiple lavim. That's what's happening over here. That's again the din of bedikas talaim. The halacha really of making sure that vegetables, especially leafy vegetables, are free from insects is an incredibly important halacha. We live in a time where, thank God, one could secure such produce, albeit for a little bit of a heightened price, but nevertheless relatively easily. Is not a commercial, by the way. I just want to point out. But it really is incredibly important, because again, people think it's a chumrah. It's not a chumrah. It's not a chumrah at all. It's a halacha, and it's one of those very few things where one simple act could result in multiple lavim totally unnecessarily. So the Gemara therefore says, Nemala lo kechamesh, a person eats 1 ant, and they're in violation of 5 prohibitions. Again, Rashi goes through all the different lavim. We don't have to get into it right now. Amud Beis, Sira, person eats a hornet, lo keshesh, 6 different lavim. So both say, the only reason the Gemara is bringing this down is because you see that halacha l'maisa, 1 act of consumption could result in multiple lavim. So maybe when the Torah says lo ye'achel, by basar, by sacrificial meat which became tamei, maybe the Torah is coming to give an additional lav on the achila and telling you that if you eat it, you're in violation of 2 lavim. So it's a very interesting idea. In general, when we see what appears to be a repetitious lav, a repetitive lav, if we could find a different meaning for it, we would rather do that. In other words, we'll say it's only after we don't find another limud for the lav that we'll go ahead and we'll say, the Torah wants you to be in violation, or the Torah is making you in violation of 2 lavim. But whenever possible to go ahead and find an alternate use for the lav, that we definitely do. Therefore, again, when given the choice between saying that lo yachel means that if you eat tainted sacrificial meat, you're in violation of 2 lavim, versus saying no, lo yachel, which is extra, is coming to teaching that every time the Torah says an isra achil, it also means an isra hana, we'd rather go with the second rather than the first, because that's a novel new limud. It's only when there's an inability to go ahead and provide a novel new limud that we will say that the Torah is just coming to make you in violation of 2 lavim. Incredible. Supposed to listen to this. So the pasuk says, so remember again, meat, same pasuk, meat, sacrificial meat that comes in contact with anything that is tamei, lo ye'achel, it should not be eaten, right? Ba'ish yisrael, it should be burned in the fire. Va'basar kol tar yochal basar. Now both say, the end of the pasuk says, and any meat which is ritually pure can be consumed. So also now watch this. Va'basar she'iga b'chol tamei lo ye'achel, dereisha lamali. So both say, what do I need? Look at Rashi. Va'basar hashla da'amrit kra lav l'gufei asa, Ella le'im eno inyan teinach v'asher yiga b'chol tamei lo echav ha'basar lamis. We'll say, why do I need this first part of the pasuk of Basar Sheyiga B'Cholta? What does that come to teach me? Lamali, the rabbis Itzim Levona. Ultimately, it comes to teach you. We'll say this is actually very interesting. We actually saw this on Shabbos, that Itzim and Levona both are not. It's the Shabbos we need last Shabbos at the beginning of Rabbi Chanina's Kanakon. No, we saw it in Rabbi Chanina's Kanakon that Itzim and Levona both say that literally wood and frankincense, which are both inedible items, halacha l'maisa, are subject to the halachos of tumah. Now, what's the novelty in that? The novelty in that is that even though they are inedible, they're still going to be subject to tumah. We'll say, how could inedible objects become subject to tumah? And what's the answer? Chibas kodesh machshert. And we saw this concept that because something that is kodesh is more sensitive to tumah. So the Gemara says about basar kol tar yochal, basar the sefer lamali. Also, why do I need the basar at the end of that pasuk that says that basar that is tar can be consumed? We'll say, why is that phrase necessary at all? L'rabos imurin. Bosa is coming to go ahead and halacha l'maisa teach me about sacrificial limbs, the leftover limbs. That if halacha l'maisa again I ate the limbs in a state of tumah, I will be chayiv. Imurin behasanafka. Bosa, but imurin learned that from elsewhere. The sanyo v'nefesh asher tochal basar min zevach hashlam shal Hashem. The pasuk says that a person will go ahead. Literally v'nefesh asher tochal. If a person goes ahead and eats sacrificial items and he's tamei, he gets kares. So both say that pasuk comes to include even sacrificial limbs, to which the Gemara says, Hasam tumas haguf bekares, hacha tumas basar balav. Two different types of tumah. Both say that pasuk we just quoted is talking about if a person himself is tamei and he consumes sacrificial items, he's chayiv kares. The pasuk that we quoted before, the end of the first pasuk, which is Basar Tar Yochal Basar, is coming to exclude if the emurin are tamein. If the meat is tamei and ultimately a person consumes it, then halacha l'maisa, that is a lot. Also, an interesting distinction. If the individual is tamei and he consumes ritually pure sacrificial meat, the prohibition is kares. If a person is tahar and consumes sacrificial meat which is tamei, that is a lav. That is a lav. Here we go. I'll say another interesting derivation in this halacha. So listen to this. Kol Yisurin Shabbat. Rabbi says, and remember again, I want to point out, this is Rabbi Avo again. Keep track of the shittas here. Rabbi Avo kicked off this sugya, right? Because Rabbi Avo said that any time you find an Isra Achila, lo yochal, lo socha, lo sochlu, lo yoklu, it always means what? It always means Isra Hano as well. So now Rabbi Avo is being Mosif. Watch this. It's really quite amazing. I'm Rabbi Avo, I'm Rabbi Yochanan. Kol Yisurin Shabbat Torah. Both say really quite fascinating halacha. Anytime that there's an Isser Achila in the Torah, anytime there's a prohibition to eat something, you are only chayiv if you consumed it in a normal fashion. Rashi says, Ela derech achilasan, ela imkin achlon derech achilasan. If you consume something in a normal fashion, that is the only time, ultimately, again, that there is an Isser. To which the Gemara says, "My Amar of Sim Bara." So the Gemara El Drachalasam. My Amar of Sim Bara. Shu the Miute Shim Achal Chaylev Chay Shepater. So what does this come to exclude? If a person eats raw chaylev, so let's say you go ahead and eat. Now again, how do you normally consume chaylev? Cooked. Everyone knows that, you know. So let's say, so again, if you ate raw chaylev, then ultimately again you're pater. Why are you pater? Because although you consumed a prohibited item, you consumed it shelo kiderach achilas. And I will say, by the way, we're going to see that in general, this is a part of halacha. This comes up all the time in hilchos brachas. Right? You're also only chayv to make a bracha, or called the normative bracha, if you consume an item in the normal fashion. So therefore, Rabbi Avo says that if you go ahead and you consume something that is aser, shelo kiderach achilasan, in an abnormal way, you are not chayiv. You consume raw chaylev, you're not chayiv. Iked Amri was an alternate version of this. I'm Rabbi Avo, I'm Rabbi Yochanan. Kol Yisurin Shabbat Torah, in lokin alein ela derech hana asan. So we'll listen to this. In this Iked Amri, Rabbi Avo is actually making a little bit more of an expansive statement. Then in general, whenever you have an Isser, you're only in violation of that Isser if you benefit in the normative form of hana. Right, so I'll say, so again, the particular Isser in the Torah, you've only violated the Isser if you've enjoyed that Isser, quote unquote, enjoyed that Isser in a normative fashion. Let me utemai. What does this come to exclude? The Gemara says, Shu pater. So I would say, for example, remember Shar Niskal, ox killed someone, therefore condemned to die. You took the chaylev, and I will say, remember again, what we heard from Shar Niskal, from the phrase of Ubal Hashar Naki, we had this a few days ago. Bal Hashar Naki means the whole thing is Asr Ba'na. The whole thing is Asr Ba'na. So what did I do? Right, Reuven Shar was killed, or again, it could be my Shar also. I go ahead, I take the chaylev, I put the chaylev on a wound. Because I read, I saw that the chaylev has curative powers. So I went ahead and I put the chaylev on my wound. Then I both say, what's the halacha over there? Shu pater. Ultimately, again, a person is pater. I both say, why is a person pater? Because halacha l'maisa, that's not the normal derech hana of chaylev. Right? If you look at Rashi, it's chaylev. Ein derech hana aser ela ba'avara v'limshoch oros v'lo l'refuah. Well, this is very interesting. Actually, what was chaylev normally used for? Chaylev was used to go ahead and smear on hides. Very interesting. That was the use for chaylev. But to put a piece of chaylev, put a piece of salad chaylev on a wound, that's non-normative benefit. Shabbi Avo says you're not chayiv for non-normative benefit. The chol shekain ochel chaylev chay shu pater. It goes without saying that if you consume raw chaylev, that is certainly considered to be non-normative benefit as well. So we'll say, this is very important. So remember again, what this Ikeda Amri did was as follows. We begin by saying Rabbi Avo holds, anytime you eat on something that is usher in an abnormal fashion, not chayiv. The Ikeda Amri expands it. It's not just consumption. Anytime you benefit, right, you get hana from a davar ha'asr, something that is usher in a non-normative fashion, you're not chayiv for that hana. You take chaylev from a shar niskal, you put it on your wound, that's not a normal benefit. You consume chaylev chay, raw chaylev, that's not normal benefit. And therefore, again, you will be pater. I'm also saying, of course, pater still means what? Pater still means what? To borrow from Hilchos Shabbos, pater avalos, obviously not supposed to do it. But halacha l'maisa, again, if you did it, ultimately, again, there is no chiyuv associated with it. Itmar nami, amar Acha, Itmar nami, amar Acha bar Avyo, amar Asi, amar Yochanan, hiniach chaylev shel shar niskal gabe makasa pater. If a person went and took chaylev of a shar niskal and placed it on his wound, for apparently, again, its perceived curative powers, what's the halacha? One is pater. Why is one pater? Lefisha kol yisurin sheva Torah in lokin alein ela derech hanasim. Because we'll say in general again, when it comes to isurim in the Torah, you are only chayiv if you benefit in a normative fashion. Amar Rabbi Afana Nami Tanina. We also learn this. Ein sofkin. Listen to this. Ein sofkin asar by mishum arla ela alayotzi min azesim min hanavim bilvad. So let's listen to this. Arla, fruit of the tree for the first 3 years is going to be prohibited. So look what the Brisa says, or the Mishnah says. You don't get malchus. Let's say again, I have fruit of arla. You don't get malchus. You don't get malchus for arla consumption, except for the juices which come out of grapes and olives. So if you drink those, then you'll be chayiv for consumption of arla. Yet, interesting enough, also yet if let's say again you have juice from berries, from figs, from pomegranates, the consumption of those juices is considered to be non-normative benefit. So we saw this by Hilchos Shabbos, by Hilchos of Schita by Shabbos. Namely, again, that in the eyes of Chazal, only the juices from olives and grapes are significant. The juices from everything else is not. Therefore, again, halacha l'maisa, if I drink the juices of olives or of grapes, I'm going to be chayiv. I'm going to be chayiv for all the consumption. But if I go ahead and halacha l'maisa drink the juices that come out of any of these other items, I'm not chayiv. My time, but what's the reason? Lab mishum delo ka'achelu derech hana asan. It must be because, again, drinking the juice from pomegranates, from figs, or from other berries is considered to be non-normative benefit. So 1 second. Only that by bishlama iyashmin and pre-gufa. So Sabai says, no, that's actually not a good proof. See, if you would have phrased the case as actual consumption of the fruit, and if you would have shown that, for example, let's say, for argument's sake, consumption of one fruit, you're chayiv for arla, consumption of a different fruit, you're not chayiv, then I could have said ultimately again that this is shelo k'derech hana asan. But once you get into juices is a different discussion. The Gemara says, do you know why you're not chayiv for consuming arla? If you drink the juices of a pomegranate, a fig, or of berries, that's for a different reason. To which the Gemara says, Both say the difference is that when you have juices that emanate ultimately again from anything other than grapes and olives, that juice is considered to be zeh. Both say zeh literally means sweat. In other words, those juices are considered to be totally insignificant. So when you go ahead and you drink the juices that come out of olives, you come out of grapes, that's significant, and therefore again you're chayiv for arla consumption. But if halacha l'maisa you drink the juices that come out of any of these other fruits, you're not chayiv. But it's not that you're not chayiv because of non-normative consumption. You're not chayiv because that act of consumption is not even considered to be an act of consumption. Because the juices that comes out of those items, those other fruits, ultimately in the eyes of halacha is considered to be insignificant. It has absolutely no weight to it, and therefore again it's not arla consumption. I will say we'll pick up with this sugya tomorrow. This sugya will say of non-normative hana, non-normative consumption is actually quite fascinating. We'll continue a bit more in a minute. We'll see the halacha l'maisa and there is the machlokes in Chizkiya and Rabbi Avau as well. Shkoyach.